20,000 years ago, Earth was a different planet. Not metaphorically, literally. You could walk from London to Paris on dry land. Mammoths grazed where New York Harbor sits today. The Sahara Desert was a green savanna with lakes and rivers. Sea levels were 400 feet lower. Ice sheets covered a quarter of all land. The air itself had half the carbon dioxide we breathe today. This wasn't just colder weather. Every system that makes Earth habitable had been completely rewired. Ocean currents, wind patterns, the water cycle itself. Yet somehow, our ancestors didn't just survive on this alien world. They thrived. They painted masterpieces. They invented music. They became truly human for the first time. Stay until the end, and I'll prove to you that 20,000 years ago, Earth really was a different planet. If you're here to fall asleep, perfect. You're in the right place. And if you're listening from home, tell me your city and what time it is there. I love reading them. Whether it's 3 a.m. in Tokyo or 9 p.m. in Sao Paulo, we're all sharing this moment, thinking about a time when our planet wore a completely different face. Stay until the end, and I'll prove to you that 20,000 years ago, Earth really was a different planet. Part 1. A world locked in ice. 21,000 years ago, Earth reached what scientists call the last glacial maximum, the LGM, the moment when ice ruled the world more completely than it ever had during human existence, or ever would again. Close your eyes and imagine stepping outside your door, but not into the world you know. Instead, you emerge into a planet where the average temperature is 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. That's 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder everywhere, all the time. Not just a bad winter, a different climate entirely. The air itself would taste different. When you breathe, you're pulling in atmosphere with only 180 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Today, in February 2025, we're at 427 parts per million. The very chemistry of the sky was alien. But temperature and atmosphere are just numbers until you see what they created. Ice sheets stretched across continents like frozen oceans made of land. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and reached down into what we now call the northern United States. Imagine ice 2 kilometers thick, that's over a mile, pressing down on the landscape. The Eurasian ice sheet sprawled from Scandinavia across northern Russia. Together, glaciers and ice sheets covered 8% of Earth's entire surface. 25% of all land. Think about that for a moment. 1/4 of all land on Earth was buried under ice. All that frozen water had to come from somewhere, the oceans. Sea level dropped 120 to 125 meters below where it sits today, 400 feet lower. Continental shelves that are now underwater became vast plains stretching to horizons you can't imagine from today's coastlines. But here's what made this world truly alien: the wind and dust. Ice core records from Antarctica tell us that dust levels during the LGM were 2 to 20 times higher than today. At some locations, like Dome Sea, dust was 25 times thicker in the air. The planet was windier, drier, more exposed. Without forests to hold soil in place, dust storms scoured continents and painted the sky brown. The global water cycle, the engine that moves moisture from oceans to land and back, ran at half speed. Rain came rarely, rivers ran smaller, lakes shrank or disappeared entirely, deserts expanded. Sand dunes marched across landscapes that would later bloom as farmland. Ocean currents, those massive conveyor belts of heat that keep our modern climate stable, followed completely different paths. The massive northern hemisphere ice sheets changed how air moved around the planet, how heat traveled from the equator toward the poles. The whole system of winds and currents that we think of as normal was rearranged. And life? Life adapted or moved or vanished. Forest boundaries crept toward the equator. Tree lines marched downhill. What we now call the Arctic tundra extended much farther south. But in its place, covering huge stretches of northern Eurasia and Alaska, was something that no longer exists: the mammoth steppe. A cold, dry grassland more productive than anything we see today, supporting herds of giants that have no modern equivalent. This wasn't just colder weather. This was a complete reorganization of how Earth worked. The patterns of wind and water, ice and land, heat and cold, all of it different, all of it alien to us. When you look at satellite images of Earth from space today, you see a blue marble swirled with white clouds. 20,000 years ago, that marble was whiter, browner, and the swirls followed different rules entirely. Yet somehow, in this transformed world, our ancestors not only survived, they began to thrive in ways that would reshape what it meant to be human forever. Part 2. The Map of a Different Planet. Stand on the white cliffs of Dover today, and you're looking across 21 miles of choppy water toward France. 20,000 years ago, you could have walked there. No English Channel, no North Sea, just rolling hills and river valleys stretching from Yorkshire to the Netherlands. The land connecting Britain to Europe wasn't just a narrow bridge. It was a country-sized territory called Doggerland, complete with rivers, lakes, forests, and the archaeological traces of the people who called it home. For thousands of years, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in villages along rivers that flowed north through what we now call the North Sea. But Doggerland's story doesn't start with its drowning. It starts with its birth, in violence. Long before the last glacial maximum, catastrophic megafloods carved the Dover Strait. Picture a wall of water taller than skyscrapers, moving faster than a freight train, ripping through bedrock like tissue paper. These floods created the Channel River system, the underwater canyon that still guides currents between Britain and France today. The geography that would later determine how Britain became an island was written in stone by floods that make any modern disaster look like a puddle. Turn your attention east, towards Siberia and Alaska. Today, 55 miles of frigid Bering Strait separate Russia from America. 20,000 years ago, that gap was filled by Beringia, not just a land bridge, but a subcontinent. 1,000 miles wide, stretching from eastern Siberia across to western Alaska and beyond. Vast, low-relief grasslands supporting herds of mammoth, bison, and horse. Rivers meandering across plains where walruses now dive. By 10,000 years ago, rising seas flooded the Bering and Chukchi shelves, severing the connection between continents. But for the better part of 20,000 years, Asia and North America were one landmass. Fly south in your imagination to Southeast Asia and Australia. The shallow seas between them, some of the most biodiverse marine environments on Earth today, were dry land. The Sunda Shelf connected Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines into a single landmass. Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea formed another continent called Sahul. Only narrow straits separated these expanded landmasses, creating entirely different pathways for both animals and humans. But perhaps the most mind-bending feature of this lost world was hiding in plain sight. Mega rivers flowing across what are now ocean floors. The Channel River didn't just appear during those ancient megafloods, it kept flowing throughout the last glacial maximum. Fed by tributaries draining ice sheets across northern Europe, it carried meltwater and sediment hundreds of miles across the exposed English Channel and out into the Atlantic. Similar river systems flowed across the North Sea, the Bering Strait, and continental shelves around the world. These weren't small streams. They were major waterways carving canyons, depositing deltas, creating the kind of rich riparian environments that humans have always gravitated toward. Rivers with salmon runs, estuaries thick with waterfowl, floodplains perfect for seasonal camps. And here's the archaeological challenge. Many of the richest Paleolithic sites, the places where our ancestors lived for thousands of years, are now hundreds of feet underwater. Research programs across the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific are using sonar and underwater robots to map these drowned landscapes. They're finding stone tools, hearths, even the remains of ancient forests still rooted in underwater soil. Each discovery rewrites our understanding of how and where our ancestors lived. The numbers tell the story in stark terms. From the last glacial maximum to the middle of the Holocene, our current warm period, global sea level rose 120 to 130 meters. That's roughly 40 stories of vertical rise. But it didn't happen gradually. It came in pulses, some of them so rapid they would have been visible to anyone living through them. Imagine waking up each morning to find the shoreline a little farther inland. Imagine seasonal camps that became islands. Imagine river mouths that became bays, then inland seas, then forgotten stories beneath the waves. This is why our picture of Ice Age humanity is incomplete. The richest coastal environments, the places with the most resources, the easiest travel routes, the most appealing campsites, are all underwater now. We're trying to understand our ancestors while missing some of their most important chapters. But what we can see, on the dry land that survived the flooding, tells us something remarkable. Our species didn't just endure this transformed world. We spread across it, we made it ours, and in doing so, we became something new ourselves. Part 3. Life on the Mammoth Steppe. Picture the largest grassland ecosystem that ever existed, stretching from northern Spain across Siberia, over the Beringia land bridge, and into Alaska and the Yukon. 30 million square kilometers of cold, dry steppe tundra, supporting more large animals per square mile than the African savanna today. This was the Mammoth Steppe, and it was nothing like any biome that exists now. Step onto this grassland 20,000 years ago, and the ground beneath your feet would be permanently frozen just inches down, permafrost that locked away enormous stores of organic carbon. But on the surface, life exploded in abundance. Grasses, herbs, and scattered shrubs created a mosaic of grazing that could support unimaginable herds. The woolly mammoth was the ecosystem's engineer. Bulls standing 11 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in hair up to 3 feet long, with curved tusks that could span 14 feet tip to tip. Herds of mammoths moved across the steppe like living bulldozers, knocking down trees, trampling shrubs, and maintaining the grassland through sheer force. But they weren't alone. Steppe bison grazed in herds that stretched to the horizon, not the woodland bison we know today, but a larger, more robust species adapted to open country. Wild horses thundered across these plains in numbers that dwarfed any modern population. Musk oxen formed defensive circles against predators, their thick coats and massive horns evolved for survival in perpetual cold. Saiga antelope bounded across the steppes with their inflated, trunk-like noses that warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. Woolly rhinoceros, massive and solitary, used their flattened horns like snowplows to uncover buried vegetation. And hunting them all was a cast of predators that would make a modern wildlife enthusiast's heart race and stop at the same time. Cave lions, not quite lions as we know them, but the largest cats that ever lived, stalked herds across the open steppe. Packs of dire wolves, larger and more powerful than any wolf today, coordinated hunts on animals that outweighed them 10 to 1. Short-faced bears, standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder and capable of running faster than a racehorse, claimed carcasses from any predator unlucky enough to cross their path. The sheer productivity of this ecosystem staggers the imagination. Permafrost soils called Yodoma, still found across the Arctic today, contain organic carbon deposits that tell the story. Plants grew fast and thick during brief Arctic summers, then froze before they could fully decompose. Layer after layer of frozen organic matter accumulated over thousands of years. Ancient DNA extracted from this permafrost reveals the biological richness. Not just the giants we know from fossils, but a complete web of life. Arctic foxes, wolverines, lemmings, ground squirrels, countless species of plants, even insects preserved in the frozen soil. But here's the mystery that haunts paleontologists. Between 13,500 and 10,000 years ago, this entire world vanished. The Mammoth Steppe collapsed as climates warmed and moistened. Shrubs and forests expanded northward, breaking up the continuous grasslands. Without vast, unbroken ranges, the great herds couldn't sustain themselves. One by one, species began to disappear. The cause of the extinctions has sparked decades of scientific debate. Climate-first advocates point to the rapid habitat change. As the world warmed, the dry grasslands that megafauna depended on gave way to wetlands, forests, and tundra. The mammoth steppe became fragmented, then disappeared entirely. Human-first advocates argue for the overkill hypothesis. Our ancestors had developed sophisticated hunting technologies and were spreading into new continents just as extinctions accelerated. The timing, they argue, is too close to be coincidental. Most scientists now favor a synergy model. Climate change destabilized ecosystems, making populations vulnerable. Human hunting pressure then pushed weakened species over the edge. The specific details varied from species to species, region to region, but the combined pressures proved overwhelming. The last mainland mammoths died around 11,000 years ago, but the story didn't end there. On Wrangel Island, a small piece of land in the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia, a population of mammoths survived in isolation until just 4,000 years ago. These island dwarfs lived through the rise of agriculture, the building of the pyramids, and the founding of cities, finally disappearing when the Bronze Age was already underway. Recent genetic studies of the Wrangel mammoths reveal the challenges of survival in small populations. Inbreeding, loss of genetic diversity, and random mutations accumulated over thousands of years. But their final extinction may not have been inevitable. They survived for 6,000 years after their mainland cousins vanished. Something specific happened in their final centuries that we still don't understand. Some researchers have proposed an intriguing hypothesis. The megaherbivores didn't just depend on the grasslands, they helped create and maintain them. By trampling shrubs, fertilizing soil with their dung, and preventing forests from taking hold, massive herds of grazers might have been ecosystem engineers on a continental scale. If this hypothesis is correct, then losing the megafauna caused the collapse of the grasslands, which made recovery impossible. It's a feedback loop that some scientists are now trying to reverse with projects like Pleistocene Park, an attempt to restore mammoth steppe grasslands using surviving megafauna species. But 20,000 years ago, none of this decline was visible on the horizon. The mammoth steppe was the stage for one of the most remarkable stories in human history, our species' expansion into some of the harshest environments on Earth, and our first steps toward becoming a truly global species. Part 4. The First Global Humans. 20,000 years ago, while ice sheets locked up a quarter of the world's land, small bands of humans had already spread from African savannas to the edge of the Arctic Circle. They lived in places where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and the sun disappeared for months at a time. How did they do it? How did our ancestors, with no metal tools, no agriculture, and no permanent shelters, master environments that challenge us today, even with all our technology? The answer lies in a combination of ingenuity, cooperation, and knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop. Start with the Yana RHS sites in northern Siberia, 33,000 years ago, well before the last glacial maximum even began. North of the Arctic Circle, where winter lasts 8 months and summer is a brief, buggy dream, archaeologists have found bone awls, ivory beads, and most remarkably, eyed needles. Eyed needles. Think about what that means. Someone sat in the Arctic cold, carefully drilling a hole through bone or ivory, smoothing it until thread could pass through cleanly. This wasn't just tool making, this was precision manufacturing. And the needles tell us something crucial. These people were making tailored, fitted clothing, parkas, mittens, boots, clothing that could keep a human alive at 60 below zero. But tools were just the beginning. Survival in the Ice Age Arctic required a completely different way of thinking about space, time, and community. Picture a band of 25 people moving across the Beringia steppe in late summer. The adults walk in a loose formation, constantly scanning for game trails, water sources, and shelter materials. Children as young as 5 or 6 help identify plants, track small animals, and maintain the complex social relationships that keep the group functioning. They're not wandering randomly. Every step follows knowledge accumulated over generations. This valley has fresh water in late summer but floods during spring melt. That ridge offers shelter from north winds but becomes a wind tunnel when storms come from the west. This patch of willows provides bark for medicine and flexible wood for arrows, but only if harvested before the sap runs. The Bering Land Bridge wasn't just a corridor between continents, it was home for thousands of years. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that Beringia supported human populations throughout the last glacial maximum, possibly serving as a population source for later movements both west into Asia and east into the Americas. But getting to the Americas required more than just walking east from Beringia. Massive ice sheets blocked overland routes for thousands of years. This has led many archaeologists to propose a kelp highway, a coastal route that followed the Pacific shoreline. Kelp forests are among the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. They provide not just food, fish, shellfish, seaweed, marine mammals, but also materials for boats, nets, and tools. A coastal migration route could have provided rich resources and relatively predictable conditions for traveling peoples. The challenge for archaeologists is that this hypothetical coastal route is now mostly underwater. The evidence for early coastal peoples is largely submerged beneath 120 meters of sea level rise. We're trying to reconstruct one of the most important human migrations in history, while missing most of the places where it happened. What we can see on dry land tells us about the sophistication of Ice Age societies. At Mezirich in Ukraine, archaeologists have found structures built from mammoth bones, not just random piles but carefully engineered dwellings using skulls, tusks, and leg bones as architectural elements. Recent radiocarbon dating has revised our understanding of when these bone houses were built and occupied, showing complex patterns of seasonal use over hundreds of years. At Ohalo 2 in Israel, a 23,000-year-old campsite preserves brush huts with central hearths, grass bedding, and evidence of textile production. But the most remarkable find is the plant remains. Over 90,000 seeds, nuts, and other plant parts representing a diet that included over 100 species of plants. Think about that level of botanical knowledge. Someone in this camp could identify, at the right season and growth stage, more than 100 different plants. They knew which parts were edible, which required processing to remove toxins, which were best fresh, and which could be stored. This represents thousands of years of accumulated observation and experimentation. The tools found at these sites reveal the sophistication of Ice Age technology. Composite projectile points with multiple parts fitted together, bone fish hooks, cordage twisted from plant fibers, evidence of nets for fishing and bird catching. Stone tools so precisely made that archaeologists can reconstruct the exact sequence of strikes used to shape them. But perhaps the most important technology was social. Ice Age hunter-gatherer bands were small, usually 25 to 50 people, but they maintained contact networks spanning hundreds of miles. Raw materials for tools traveled vast distances through trade relationships. Genetic studies of modern populations suggest that Ice Age peoples maintained marriage networks that prevented inbreeding across enormous territories. These networks did more than just move goods and genes. They moved information. Knowledge of weather patterns, animal behavior, plant locations, and tool techniques spread through these social webs faster than any individual band could travel. When climate shifted or herds moved, human communities could adapt because they were plugged into continent-spanning information networks. Population densities were incredibly low by modern standards. Estimates suggest that all of Europe during the last glacial maximum supported maybe 10,000 people total. The entire world might have held fewer humans than a modern mid-sized city. But these sparse populations were connected across vast distances by relationships, obligations, and shared knowledge that made them far more resilient than their numbers might suggest. They were our ancestors, living through the harshest climate conditions our species has ever experienced. And they didn't just survive, they developed new technologies, new social systems, and new forms of cultural expression that laid the foundation for everything that came after. Which brings us to one of the most mysterious aspects of Ice Age life, the explosion of art, music, and symbolic behavior that occurred precisely during this period of maximum environmental stress. Part 5. The Birth of Human Imagination. Deep in the Chauvet Cave in southern France, 36,000 years ago, someone held a piece of charcoal and began to draw. Not simple scratches or geometric symbols, but lifelike animals moving across the cave wall with such skill that modern artists study them for technique. Lions prowling in formation, their muscles taut with predatory focus. Horses galloping so convincingly you can almost hear their hooves. Rhinoceros charging toward unseen enemies, every line capturing the weight and momentum of tons of muscle and bone in motion. But here's what makes Chauvet extraordinary. The artist understood perspective, shading, and visual narrative. They used the natural contours of the cave wall to give three-dimensional form to two-dimensional drawings. They layered images to show herds in depth. They captured not just what animals looked like, but how they moved, how they related to each other, how they existed in space and time. This wasn't primitive art. This was sophisticated visual storytelling by someone with a masterful understanding of both animal behavior and artistic technique. And Chauvet wasn't unique. At Lascaux, 17,000 years ago, artists created the most famous prehistoric art gallery in the world. The Great Hall of the Bulls showcases aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, painted so large they dominate the ceiling like a prehistoric Sistine Chapel. The technique is flawless. Mineral pigments mixed with binding agents, applied with brushes made from hair and plant fibers, using scaffolding to reach high surfaces. At Altamira in Spain, artists worked over thousands of years, from 36,000 to 14,000 years ago, creating layered masterpieces that show evolving styles and techniques across generations. The famous polychrome ceiling paintings of bison use the natural bulges of the cave ceiling to give the animals three-dimensional form. When you lie on your back and look up by flickering torchlight, the way the original artists intended, the bison seem to breathe. But art wasn't limited to cave walls. At Hohl Fels Cave in Germany, archaeologists found something that changed our understanding of Ice Age culture entirely. A flute carved from the wing bone of a griffon vulture, 40,000 years old. The oldest known musical instrument. Imagine the scene. Winter camp in the Swabian Alps, snow piled against the cave entrance, families gathered around central fires. Someone picks up this carefully crafted bone flute and begins to play. Notes echoing off cave walls, children learning melodies that encode stories. Adults synchronized in dances that strengthen social bonds during the hardest months of the year. Music wasn't decoration in the Ice Age, it was technology. Social technology that helped groups maintain cohesion, transmit cultural information, and coordinate activities across time and space. The Hohl Fels Cave yielded another extraordinary find, the Venus of Hohl Fels, a small figurine carved from mammoth ivory 40,000 years ago. The carving shows remarkable skill, smooth curves, careful attention to anatomical details, and symbolic elements that suggest meaning beyond mere representation. Similar figurines have been found across Europe, from the Pyrenees to Siberia. Some emphasize fertility and reproduction, others focus on clothing and adornment. Still, others seem to represent specific individuals. Archaeologists debate their meaning, but their widespread distribution and careful craftsmanship suggest they played important roles in Ice Age societies. The sophistication of Ice Age art required more than just individual talent. It required specialized knowledge of materials and techniques that took years to master. Artists ground iron ochres and manganese oxides to create red, yellow, and black pigments. They mixed these mineral colors with binders, animal fats, plant resins, even saliva, to create paints that would adhere to cave walls for thousands of years. They made charcoal from specific types of wood that burned at the right temperature to create deep blacks. They used hollow bones as stencils and animal hair as brushes. The logistics were staggering. Creating the Lascaux paintings required scaffolding, artificial lighting, and teams of people working in coordination. Stone lamps filled with animal fat provided steady light. Juniper twigs served as wicks. The smoke residue from these lamps can still be detected on cave ceilings today. Why did art explode during the Ice Age? Why did our ancestors, struggling for survival in the harshest climate in human history, invest enormous time and energy in creating beauty? One hypothesis focuses on information storage. In societies without writing, visual art could encode crucial knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and hunting techniques. The cave paintings might represent not just artistic expression, but educational curricula, ways of teaching young hunters about the animals they would need to understand intimately. Another hypothesis emphasizes social cohesion. Creating art required cooperation, planning, and shared vision. The process of making art together could strengthen group bonds during stressful periods. And the finished artworks provided focal points for gatherings, ceremonies, and storytelling that reinforced cultural identity. Recent research has discovered something intriguing about the placement of art in caves. Many paintings are located in chambers with exceptional acoustic properties. The same spots where animals are painted are often the spots where sounds resonate most clearly. This suggests that art and music were combined in Ice Age ceremonies, multimedia performances that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. But perhaps the most important function of Ice Age art was psychological. Creating beauty in a harsh world might have been a way of asserting human agency in the face of environmental challenges. When you can't control the weather, when you can't guarantee your next meal, when winter might kill anyone who makes a mistake, creating something beautiful becomes an act of defiance against chaos. The artists of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira weren't just decorating caves. They were inventing symbolic thought, developing techniques for storing and transmitting cultural information, and creating the foundations for human imagination as we know it today. Their legacy lives on not just in the paintings they left behind, but in the human capacity to find meaning, create beauty, and tell stories that transcend immediate survival needs. In the depths of the Ice Age, when survival was never guaranteed, our ancestors invented the idea that life could be about more than just staying alive. Part 6. Survival against the elements. Picture a winter night on the Mammoth Steppe. The wind screams across endless grassland at 40 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to 50 below zero. In this killing cold, exposed human skin freezes solid in minutes. Death comes quickly to anyone caught unprepared. But inside a carefully constructed shelter, a family tends a central fire, warm and safe against the Arctic fury outside. Children play games with carved bone pieces while adults repair tools and tell stories. The difference between life and death lies not in luck, but in thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to stay alive when nature wants you dead. The Ohalo 2 site in Israel gives us an extraordinary window into Ice Age domestic life. 23,000 years ago, a brush hut camp along an ancient lake preserved details that are usually lost to time. Central hearths surrounded by careful arrangements of sleeping areas. Bedding made from grasses and reeds, changed regularly to maintain insulation and hygiene. Activity areas where specific tasks were performed. Tool making near good light. Food processing near water. Textile work near the fire. But the most remarkable find at Ohalo 2 was the evidence of fire control, not just the ability to make fire, but sophisticated management of combustion for different purposes. Cooking fires built with specific wood types to control heat and minimize smoke. Smudge fires to drive away insects. High heat fires for tool making and hide processing. Even specialized fires for making the plant-based adhesives used to attach stone points to wooden shafts. Fire wasn't just about warmth and light. It was a Swiss Army knife of survival technology. The eyed needles found at sites like Jana RHS tell the story of perhaps the most crucial Ice Age invention, tailored clothing. Modern experiments with replica garments show that properly fitted Arctic clothing could keep a person comfortable at temperatures that would kill them in minutes if they were naked. But making such clothing required encyclopedic knowledge of animal hides and plant fibers. Which animals provided the best fur for outer garments versus inner layers? How to tan hides so they remained flexible in extreme cold? Which sinews made the strongest thread? How to waterproof seams with fat and pine resin? A complete Ice Age outfit might include inner layers of soft, warm fur worn against the skin, middle layers of tighter, woven material for insulation, outer shells of tough, water-resistant hide, separate hood, mittens, and boots, all carefully fitted and sealed against wind and moisture. Creating one such outfit required processing hides from multiple animals and represented weeks of skilled labor. But without it, survival in Ice Age winters was impossible. Some of the most impressive Ice Age architecture comes from sites like Mezirich in Ukraine, where people built homes from mammoth bones. These weren't desperate improvisations, they were carefully engineered structures that required detailed understanding of load-bearing, insulation, and structural stability. A typical mammoth bone house used mammoth skulls as a foundation, with long bones and tusks creating a framework that supported walls made from hides and additional bones. The structures were semi-subterranean, dug into the ground for additional insulation and stability. Recent archaeological work has revealed that these houses were occupied seasonally over hundreds of years, with evidence of repairs, modifications, and expansions across generations. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Ice Age survival was not technological, but nutritional. The plant assemblage from Ohalo 2 represents one of the broadest prehistoric diets ever documented. Over 100 species of plants, plus fish, birds, small mammals, and large game. This dietary diversity wasn't accidental. It represented systematic knowledge of nutrition, food processing, and seasonal availability that took millennia to develop. Which plants provided complete proteins? Which ones contained essential vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases? How to process plants to remove natural toxins? Which combinations of foods provided balanced nutrition during long winter months when fresh food was scarce? Ice Age peoples developed an entire toolkit of food processing techniques. Grinding stones for making flour from seeds and nuts, boiling pits for extracting nutrients from bones and tough plant materials, smoking and drying techniques for food preservation, underground storage pits that used permafrost as natural refrigeration. The fishing technology found at sites across Europe shows remarkable sophistication. Bone fish hooks sized for different species, net weights indicating the use of large fishing nets, evidence of fish weirs, underwater traps that funneled migrating fish into enclosed areas where they could be easily harvested. But individual technological solutions were only part of the survival equation. The key to Ice Age survival was social, the ability to coordinate group activities, share resources, and maintain cooperation even under extreme stress. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age camps followed carefully organized spatial patterns. Central areas for communal activities like cooking and toolmaking, private family spaces around the periphery, specialized work areas for particularly messy or dangerous tasks, waste disposal areas placed to minimize contamination of water sources. This spatial organization wasn't arbitrary. It reflected sophisticated understanding of hygiene, social dynamics, and efficient resource use. Living in close quarters during long winters required careful management of interpersonal relationships and shared resources. The distribution of artifacts at Ice Age sites reveals evidence of task specialization. Some individuals became experts at stone tool production. Others specialized in hide processing, bone carving, or plant processing. This specialization increased efficiency and allowed for the development of complex technologies that no individual could master alone. Risk management was built into every aspect of Ice Age life. Multiple food sources to buffer against the failure of any single resource. Mobility strategies that avoided overexploitation of local resources. Social networks that provided mutual support during crises. Knowledge systems that preserved crucial survival information across generations. The health evidence from Ice Age sites paints a mixed picture. Signs of nutritional stress, cold injury, and trauma from hunting accidents are common. But there's also evidence of care for sick and injured group members, suggesting that Ice Age societies valued individuals beyond their immediate economic contribution. Infectious diseases would have been a constant threat, especially in densely occupied winter camps. But the small size of Ice Age populations and their mobility patterns may have limited the spread of epidemics that devastated later agricultural societies. Perhaps most remarkably, Ice Age peoples developed all of these survival technologies while maintaining the rich cultural lives documented in their art, music, and symbolic objects. Survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about maintaining the social relationships, cultural knowledge, and spiritual practices that made life worth living. Their success in this endeavor laid the foundation for everything that came after. When the ice began to retreat 20,000 years later, human societies were positioned to take advantage of new opportunities precisely because they had learned to thrive under impossible conditions. The end of the Ice Age didn't just change the climate. It unleashed human potential that had been honed by thousands of years of survival against the elements. Part 7. Turning Point. The End of an Ice Age. 19,000 years ago, something shifted. Ice sheets that had grown for thousands of years began to shrink. Glaciers that had advanced relentlessly southward started their retreat. The change was subtle at first, a few degrees of warming here, slightly more summer melting there. But it marked the beginning of the most dramatic transformation Earth had experienced since humans became a global species. The numbers tell a story of almost unimaginable change. From the last glacial maximum to the Middle Holocene, our current warm period, global sea levels rose 120 to 130 meters. That's a 40-story building worth of vertical rise. But the rise didn't happen gradually. It came in pulses so rapid they would have been visible to anyone living through them. The most dramatic pulse came 14,600 years ago, Meltwater Pulse 1A. In just a few centuries, maybe less, sea levels jumped 8 to 18 meters. At its fastest, seas were rising at 4 meters per century. That's more than a foot per decade, fast enough for coastal peoples to watch their shorelines retreat year by year. Where did all that water come from? Ice sheets across North America and Europe were hemorrhaging meltwater into the oceans. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of Canada with ice 2 kilometers thick, began collapsing from its southern margins. The Eurasian ice sheet retreated across Scandinavia and northern Russia. Even Antarctica may have contributed massive pulses of meltwater as ice shelves collapsed and glaciers accelerated toward the sea. But the meltwater did more than just raise sea levels. It disrupted the ocean circulation patterns that had kept the planet's climate stable for thousands of years. Picture the Atlantic Ocean as a giant conveyor belt. Warm, salty water flows north from the tropics. As it cools in the Arctic, it becomes dense and sinks, then flows back south along the ocean floor. This circulation pattern, called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, transports enormous amounts of heat from the equator toward the poles. When massive pulses of fresh meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, they disrupted this delicate system. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, so it floated on the surface instead of sinking. The conveyor belt slowed down, or even shut off entirely. Heat transport from the tropics was reduced. The North Atlantic region cooled dramatically even as global temperatures continued to rise. This oceanographic chaos set the stage for one of the most mysterious episodes in Earth's climate history, the Younger Dryas. 12,900 years ago, just as the world was warming rapidly out of the Ice Age, temperatures suddenly plummeted back toward glacial conditions. The cooling was dramatic. In some regions, average temperatures dropped 10 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The Mammoth Steppe, which had been fragmenting as forests expanded north, temporarily recovered in some areas. The Younger Dryas lasted 1,300 years, long enough for entire human generations to be born, live, and die during what seemed like a return to the Ice Age. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the cold snap ended. Temperatures rose even faster than they had fallen, jumping 10 degrees in some regions in less than a decade. What caused this climatic whiplash? The leading explanation points to meltwater routing changes in North America. As the Laurentide ice sheet retreated, the drainage patterns of glacial lakes shifted dramatically. Water that had been flowing south through the Mississippi River system was suddenly diverted east through the St. Lawrence River directly into the North Atlantic. This massive pulse of fresh water disrupted ocean circulation and triggered the rapid cooling. A minority of scientists have proposed an alternative explanation, a cosmic impact. They argue that a comet or asteroid struck the Laurentide ice sheet 12,900 years ago, causing rapid melting and climate disruption. While this impact hypothesis remains controversial and has not gained widespread acceptance, it illustrates how dramatic and puzzling the Younger Dryas remains to researchers. Whatever caused it, the Younger Dryas had profound effects on both natural ecosystems and human societies. Many plant and animal species that had been recovering from the Ice Age suffered additional stress. Some megafauna populations that had survived the initial warming were finally pushed to extinction during this second round of environmental disruption. For human populations, the Younger Dryas represented both challenge and opportunity. Groups that had specialized in Ice Age hunting and gathering found their lifestyles suddenly relevant again, but populations that had begun adapting to warmer, more forested conditions faced new pressures. When the Younger Dryas finally ended 11,700 years ago, the warming was so rapid and dramatic that it marked a clear boundary in Earth's history. The Pleistocene epoch, the Ice Age, was over. The Holocene, our current geological period, had begun, but the end of glacial conditions didn't mean the end of rapid environmental change. As ice sheets continued to shrink and sea levels continued to rise, entire continental shelves were flooded. Coastlines advanced inland at rates measured in miles per century. River valleys became estuaries, hills became islands, plains became shallow seas. For human populations, this flooding represented both catastrophic loss and unprecedented opportunity. Coastal peoples who had lived for generations in river valleys and on continental shelves were forced to relocate as their homelands disappeared beneath rising waters. Seasonal camps became permanently submerged. Sacred sites vanished under waves. Entire cultural landscapes were erased, but the same process that destroyed old worlds created new ones. As sea levels rose and coastlines advanced inland, new estuaries formed with rich shellfish beds and productive fishing grounds. New wetlands provided habitat for waterfowl and aquatic plants. New islands created refuges for both wildlife and human populations. The ecological transformations were equally dramatic. As temperatures warmed and precipitation patterns shifted, forests began marching northward. The mammoth steppe, which had dominated northern Eurasia for tens of thousands of years, fragmented into isolated patches, then disappeared entirely. Tundra vegetation retreated toward the poles. Grasslands gave way to woodlands. These habitat changes had cascading effects on animal populations. Species that had thrived in the cold, dry conditions of the Ice Age found themselves marooned in shrinking habitat islands. Many large mammals that had survived the initial warming couldn't adapt to the rapidly changing vegetation. The great herds of the mammoth steppe dwindled and disappeared, taking with them the predators and scavengers that had depended on them. The timing of these ecological changes varied dramatically by region. In some areas, forests advanced rapidly as soon as temperatures began to rise. In others, the transition from grassland to woodland took thousands of years. These differences created a patchwork of environments across the northern continents, with some areas retaining Ice Age characteristics long after others had transformed completely. Human populations faced the challenge of adapting to this rapidly changing world. Groups that had specialized in hunting large mammals found their prey disappearing. Communities that had depended on specific plant resources discovered that familiar species were being replaced by unfamiliar ones. Social networks that had connected groups across vast distances were disrupted as populations moved and territories shifted, but humans proved remarkably adaptable. Archaeological evidence from this period shows rapid innovation in tools, techniques, and subsistence strategies. New types of projectile points appeared, designed for hunting smaller, more agile prey. Fishing technology became more sophisticated as coastal resources became more important. Plant processing techniques evolved to take advantage of new food sources. Perhaps most importantly, human social organization began to change in ways that would ultimately lead to agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex societies. The abundance and predictability of resources in some post-glacial environments allowed for larger, more sedentary populations. The need to manage new types of resources led to new forms of social cooperation and resource sharing. The deglaciation period, roughly from 19,000 to 6,000 years ago, represents one of the most rapid and dramatic environmental changes in Earth's history. Global average temperatures rose by roughly the same amount they have risen since the Industrial Revolution, but the changes were accompanied by massive ice sheet collapse, dramatic sea level rise, and complete reorganization of global ecosystems. For our ancestors, this period represented both the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Ice Age adaptations that had allowed humans to survive and spread across the globe were no longer sufficient. New challenges required new solutions, new social organizations, and new ways of thinking about the relationship between humans and their environment. The success of our species during this transition laid the foundation for everything that came after: agriculture, cities, writing, and ultimately, the global civilization we inhabit today. But to understand how we got from there to here, we first need to recognize how much of that ancient world still shapes our own. Part 8. Echoes in the Present. Stand on the shore of any ocean today, and you're looking at the edge of yesterday's highlands. The beach beneath your feet, the harbor where ships dock, the coastal cities that house millions of people, all of it would have been dry land when your ancestors tracked mammoth across the tundra 20,000 years ago. This isn't ancient history. This is the foundation of our modern world. London, New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, every major coastal city on Earth sits on land that was once part of vast continental shelves. The geographic advantages that made these locations perfect for ports and trade centers, the river mouths, the protected bays, the gradual approaches to deep water, were carved by Ice Age rivers flowing across exposed seabeds. The Thames didn't always empty into the Atlantic near London. 20,000 years ago, it was just one tributary of a much larger river system that flowed north across the dry English Channel and North Sea. The Amazon didn't reach the Atlantic at its current mouth, but continued hundreds of miles further east across what's now the continental shelf. The Columbia River flowed across dry land to reach the Pacific nearly 200 miles west of today's Oregon coast. These drowned river systems aren't just geographical curiosities, they're archaeological treasures that hold crucial missing chapters of human history. Research programs across the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific are using sonar mapping and underwater robots to locate the camps, villages, and seasonal sites of our Ice Age ancestors. Every discovery rewrites our understanding of how humans lived during the most dramatic period of environmental change in our species' history. Stone tools recovered from the North Sea show that people lived in Doggerland for thousands of years after the end of the last glacial maximum. Underwater forests off the California coast preserve the remains of ecosystems that supported Native American populations for millennia before rising seas changed everything. But the most profound echo of the Ice Age lives in our own DNA. Genetic analysis of modern populations reveals the deep ancestry of Ice Age survival. The people who weathered 20,000 years of glacial cold, who developed the technologies and social systems that allowed humans to thrive in impossible environments, who created the first global human culture, they are us. The ancient North Siberians, whose remains have been found at sites like Yana RHS, contributed genetic lineages that can be traced in populations from Scandinavia to the Americas. The people who painted the caves at Lascaux and Chauvet carry forward in the DNA of modern Europeans. The coastal peoples whose sites now lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean left genetic signatures in populations around the Pacific Rim. We are their direct descendants, carrying not just their genes but the legacy of their innovations, their survival strategies, and their cultural achievements. But perhaps the most urgent echo of the Ice Age relates to our current climate crisis. 20,000 years ago, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were 180 parts per million. Today, in February 2025, we've reached 427 parts per million. Human activities have pushed greenhouse gas concentrations far beyond the natural range that our species has ever experienced. The Ice Age world shows us how dramatically Earth's climate system can change and how rapidly those changes can occur. The transition out of the last glacial maximum wasn't gradual, it came in pulses and jumps that would have been visible to anyone living through them. Sea levels rose at rates of meters per century during the most rapid phases. Entire ecosystems shifted across continents in just a few thousand years. The deglaciation period offers both warning and hope for our current situation. The warning lies in the speed and magnitude of possible changes. Natural climate transitions can be extraordinarily rapid and dramatic. Ice sheets that seem stable for thousands of years can collapse in centuries. Sea levels that rise slowly for millennia can suddenly jump by meters per century. But the same period also demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of human societies. Our ancestors faced environmental changes that were in many ways more dramatic than anything we're likely to experience. They not only survived but used the challenges as opportunities to develop new technologies, new social organizations, and new ways of relating to their environment. The permafrost that locked away enormous stores of organic carbon during the Ice Age is now thawing across the Arctic. Eudomous soils that accumulated over tens of thousands of years are releasing methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Infrastructure built on permanently frozen ground is collapsing as that ground warms and softens. This isn't just an environmental issue, it's a direct connection to the Ice Age world. The permafrost now thawing contains the preserved remains of mammoth steppe ecosystems. Ancient DNA extracted from thawing permafrost includes not just mammoth and bison, but countless smaller species that lived in the most productive grassland ecosystem Earth has ever known. As this permafrost melts, we're literally witnessing the final dissolution of the Ice Age world. But archaeology is also moving in the opposite direction, deeper into the past, farther underwater, into environments that have been inaccessible since the end of the Pleistocene. New technologies for underwater exploration are revealing landscapes that have been hidden beneath the waves for 10,000 years. Autonomous underwater vehicles can map ancient shorelines with centimeter-scale precision. Deep-diving archaeologists can excavate sites that were occupied when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. Each new discovery adds detail to our understanding of how human societies adapted to rapid environmental change. The people who lived through the end of the Ice Age faced challenges remarkably similar to those we face today: rising sea levels, shifting weather patterns, changing ecosystems, and the need to adapt quickly to new conditions. Their solutions, technological innovation, social cooperation, cultural flexibility, and deep ecological knowledge, remain our best tools for navigating our own period of rapid environmental change. The last deglaciation shows us that Earth's climate system is far more dynamic and sensitive than we once believed. Small changes can trigger large responses. Gradual trends can give way to rapid transitions. Systems that seem stable can reorganize completely in just a few decades. But it also shows us that humans are remarkably adaptable when we combine individual ingenuity with collective knowledge and social cooperation. The same species that survived the harshest climate in human history, that developed the technologies and cultural innovations that define us as human, that spread across the globe and adapted to every environment on Earth, that species is us. 20,000 years ago, Earth was a different planet, but the people who lived on that planet, who survived its challenges and shaped its future, were not different from us. They were us, separated only by time. Their world ended, ours began. And now we face the challenge of ensuring that our descendants will be able to say the same thing 20,000 years from now. We are their legacy. The story kept going because we did, and it's still island.